The pilot straightened his uniform as he walked toward the crew lounge. After 15 years of flying for Skyway Airlines, the routine was familiar. Check in, review the flight plan, meet his crew, and then welcome passengers aboard. His captain's stripes, earned through thousands of hours in the cockpit, gleamed on his shoulders. Today's route was a standard domestic flight, nothing he hadn't done hundreds of times before. The crew lounge was busy that morning. Pilots and flight attendants moved about, some hurrying to their gates, others relaxing before long flights. He nodded to a few familiar faces as he made his way to the front desk. His flight wasn't for another hour, but he always liked to arrive early, review weather conditions, and mentally prepare. "Good morning," he said to the attendant at the desk, sliding his ID and flight credentials forward. "Checking in for Flight 627. The attendant glanced up, then looked at his ID without picking it up. Her expression changed slightly, a small shift he had seen countless times before. "We're having a staff meeting right now," she said, sliding his ID back. "You'll need to wait outside." He looked around the lounge, where several white pilots were chatting over coffee or reviewing flight plans. None seemed to be in a staff meeting. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping his voice even. "I don't see a meeting. I just need to check in and review my flight plan." The attendant's face hardened. "Like I said, you need to wait outside until we call you." As they spoke, another pilot, white, around the same age, approached the desk. The attendant immediately smiled. "Good morning, Captain. Go right ahead." The other pilot nodded to him with mild curiosity before walking into the lounge. No mention of waiting outside, no mention of a staff meeting. The black pilot had experienced moments like this throughout his career, subtle differences in how he was treated compared to his white colleagues. Usually, he would take a deep breath, find another way to get what he needed, and focus on his job. He had learned to pick his battles carefully in an industry where less than 2% of airline pilots looked like him. But today felt different. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of all those small moments over 15 years. Maybe it was the confidence that came with being one of the airline's most experienced pilots. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of waiting outside. "I'm the captain of Flight 627, he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's no meeting happening in there. My crew is waiting, and I need to prepare for my flight." The attendant's eyes narrowed. "I'm going to have to call security if you don't step back. Why don't you check my credentials first?" he suggested, pointing to his ID still on the counter between them. "I've been flying with this airline for 15 years. Instead of looking at his ID, the attendant picked up the phone. At that moment, the pilot made a decision. He took out his phone and began recording. "I want to document what's happening here," he explained. "I'm being denied entry to the crew lounge while other pilots are being allowed in. I've shown my ID and credentials." The lounge had grown quieter. Several pilots and flight attendants were watching now. The security guard who arrived moments later looked uncomfortable as he took in the scene. The pilot in full uniform with captain's stripes, his credentials on the counter, his phone recording. "What seems to be the problem?" the guard asked. "This person is being disruptive and refusing to leave," the attendant said. "I'm the captain of Flight 627, the pilot explained again. "I'm trying to check in for my flight, and I'm being told to wait outside while other pilots are being allowed in." He gestured to his uniform, his credentials, the other pilots in the lounge. The security guard looked at the attendant, then at the pilot, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. Before he could respond, another staff member, a supervisor, hurried over. "What's going on here?" she asked. "I just need to check in for my flight," the pilot explained once more, fatigue creeping into his voice. "I've been told to wait outside while others are walking in freely." The supervisor glanced at his credentials, then at the attendant. Something in her expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or concern about the recording phone in his hand. "Of course, Captain. Please come in. I apologize for the confusion." As he finally entered the lounge, the pilot felt eyes on him from every direction. Some sympathetic, some curious, some uncomfortable. He put his phone away but saved the recording. Something told him he might need it. He tried to focus on his flight preparations, but his mind kept returning to what had just happened. How many times had he accepted similar treatment without saying anything? How many other pilots had similar experiences every day? Little did he know that this small moment, being told to wait outside, would soon grow into something much bigger than himself, something that would shake an entire airline and perhaps an industry. But for now, he had a plane to fly and passengers who counted on him to get them safely to their destination. That was the job. That had always been the job, and he did it better than most. This wasn't the first time the pilot had faced such treatment at Skyway Airlines. Over his 15 years with the company, he kept a small notebook tucked in his flight bag. Page after page documented the small and large ways he was treated differently from his white colleagues. When new routes opened up to Hawaii and Europe, routes every pilot wanted, he was passed over despite having more experience than those who got them. The explanation was always vague, not the right fit this time, or we're looking for a different approach. He never got a straight answer about what that meant. Then there were the planes. Newer aircraft with updated systems typically went to other pilots, while he was assigned older models that sometimes had maintenance issues. Once, he had to turn back mid-flight when an aging system failed, something that could have been prevented with proper updates. The airline industry had always been a tough place for people who looked like him. At industry events, he often found himself as the only black person in a room full of hundreds. In the entire company of over 8,000 employees, there were only 23 black pilots, less than 1%. Getting his wings hadn't been easy. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, no one in his family had ever been on a plane, let alone flown one. He worked 3 jobs to pay for flight school while his friends took more traditional paths. Those early morning shifts at the gas station, weekend security work, and evening delivery routes had tested his commitment, but his dream of flying had kept him going. "You'll never make it," an instructor had once told him. This industry isn't for everyone. The comment had a clear undertone, but instead of being discouraged, it lit a fire in him. He studied twice as hard, practiced in simulators whenever he could get extra time, and graduated at the top of his class. Despite his achievements, the airline world seemed determined to remind him he was an outsider. During routine evaluations, Czech pilots scrutinized his performance with unusual intensity, writing up minor issues they would overlook with others. His files contained more additional training recommended notes than any other pilot with his experience level. What kept him going was the look on children's faces when they spotted him in the cockpit. "You're the pilot." They would ask with wide eyes and excitement, especially the black children who had never seen someone who looked like them in that position. He started carrying extra wing pins to give them, saying, "Maybe you'll fly planes someday too." Behind the scenes, he had built a support network. He started a text group for minority aviation professionals to share experiences and advice. They met monthly at a small bar near the airport, swapping stories and strategies for surviving in an industry that wasn't designed with them in mind. The group had grown from 5 people to nearly 50 over the years. He had also been quietly mentoring young people interested in aviation careers. Every month, he visited schools in neighborhoods like the one he grew up in, showing students that the sky wasn't off limits to them. 3 of his mentees had already earned their private pilot licenses, and one was now in commercial flight school. All this work had happened under the radar. He never sought recognition or made waves. "Just keep your head down and do the job better than anyone else," his father had advised when he started. "That's how we survive." But something had shifted inside him after today's humiliation. Standing outside while other pilots walked freely into the crew lounge, he felt a lifetime of similar moments crystallize into clarity. The weight of all those notebook entries, all those polite smiles after being overlooked, all those extra evaluations, it was too much to carry any longer. As he stood there in his crisp uniform with captain's stripes that had been earned through thousands of flight hours, he made a decision. This time would be different. This time, he wouldn't let it slide. The pilot walked back to his car, his uniform feeling heavier than usual. He sat behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. Instead, he pulled out his phone and replayed the video he'd recorded of the incident. Seeing it again made his stomach tighten, the dismissive tone, the security guard's hand hovering near his taser, the white pilots walking past with curious glances. He had 2 choices: file it away with all the other incidents, or finally do something about it. For the first time in his career, the thought of letting it go made him feel sick. His finger hovered over a contact, a lawyer he'd met at a community event last year. They talked about discrimination in various industries, and she'd given him her card, saying, just in case. He'd kept it tucked in his wallet, hoping he'd never need it. Today, he needed it. The call lasted nearly an hour. He shared not just today's event, but 15 years of documented incidents, the routes denied, the aircraft assignments, the extra scrutiny, the passing comments that stung, but were always just vague enough to be explained away. This isn't just about one bad day, the lawyer said. This is a pattern, and I bet you're not the only one. She was right. That night, he sent a message to his group chat of minority pilots and flight crew. I'm taking a stand. Who else has stories to share? His phone didn't stop buzzing for hours. Messages poured in, not just from his airline, but from across the industry. A flight attendant who was repeatedly assigned to work in economy while her white colleagues rotated through first class. A ground crew member passed over for promotion 8 times. A co-pilot who overheard a chief pilot say he didn't want too many of them in the cockpit. We've all been keeping our heads down, wrote one pilot. Maybe it's time to look up. Over the next week, he gathered evidence. The lawyer helped organize their approach. They needed documentation, witnesses, statistics. Another pilot who worked in scheduling secretly pulled data showing the clear pattern in route assignments. Someone in HR provided anonymized performance reviews showing the double standards in evaluations. The most powerful evidence came from passengers. He posted carefully on professional forums asking if anyone had witnessed discrimination against airline staff. Within days, he had statements from business travelers who had noticed patterns over years of flying. How certain pilots were treated differently by gate agents, how comments were made when they thought no one was listening. One executive who flew weekly wrote, "I've seen how they talk to you versus others. I never said anything because I didn't want to make trouble. I'm sorry for staying silent." The pilot also reached out to a journalist who'd covered the airline industry. Their first meeting was at a quiet coffee shop far from the airport. The journalist was skeptical at first. Allegations against a major airline could be career-risking if they didn't pan out. But as the pilot laid out the evidence, the journalist's expression changed from doubt to concern. This isn't just a story about one incident, the journalist realized. This is systemic. That's why I'm here, the pilot replied. One person being told to wait outside isn't news. But what if it's part of something much bigger? The airline's first response came quickly after the journalist's initial inquiries, a bland statement about investigating the alleged incident and commitment to diversity. The pilot had expected this. What he hadn't expected was how quickly they would try to paint him as a problem employee. An anonymous source from management leaked selective parts of his file to counter journalists friendly with the airline. They highlighted 2 delayed flights from years ago and a customer complaint that had been resolved and dismissed. The attack was transparent but still painful. His phone rang. It was another pilot, one of the few other black captains at the airline. "They just called me in for a meeting," his colleague said, voice low. "Asked me to publicly say that I've never experienced discrimination and that you're exaggerating. They implied my upcoming promotion might depend on it." The pilot felt a flash of anger, then resolve. "What did you tell them?" There was a long pause. "I said I'd think about it." Another pause. "But I'm calling you instead." "I'm with you. We all are." That night, the pilot couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, looking at the distant lights of planes crossing the dark sky. For 15 years, he'd followed the rules, kept his head down, tried to be twice as good. He believed that was enough, that if he just proved himself over and over, things would change. Now he understood nothing would change unless they made it change. Tomorrow, their story would go public. There would be no turning back. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. The headline read, "Systemic discrimination alleged at major airline." By noon, the story had spread to every major news outlet. The pilot's phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from reporters, industry insiders, and other pilots facing similar issues. The airline's stock dropped 8% before lunch. The video of him being told to wait outside while white pilots walked freely into the crew lounge played on repeat on news channels. Viewers could clearly see his captain's stripes, his professional demeanor, and the dismissive wave of the staff member's hand. It was impossible to explain away. "No comment at this time," the airline spokesperson repeated to every inquiry. Behind closed doors, though, panic was spreading through the executive floor. Emergency meetings were called. PR firms were hired. Lawyers were consulted. The Federal Aviation Administration called 3 days after the story broke. They wanted to see 15 years of hiring and promotion data. Then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission opened an investigation. They requested interviews with current and former employees about workplace culture. The pilot hadn't expected things to move so quickly. His lawyer called with updates almost hourly. "They're trying to contain this, but it's too big now," she explained. "More people are coming forward. Not just pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, gate agents. The pattern is clear." An independent audit revealed what many had suspected for years. Minority employees were given fewer opportunities for advancement. They were disciplined more harshly for the same infractions. They were paid less, even with the same experience level. The numbers told a story that couldn't be denied. The most damning evidence came from inside the company itself. A whistleblower from Human Resources leaked internal emails showing that complaints about discrimination had been systematically buried for years. One executive had written, "Just ignore it until they give up and leave. Cheaper than dealing with it." Former employees began speaking out too. A retired black flight attendant shared how she'd been passed over for international routes for 20 years despite perfect French and Spanish language skills. A former ground crew supervisor explained how minority staff were consistently assigned to the most physically demanding tasks regardless of seniority. Social media amplified these voices. The hashtag #SkywayTruth trended for days as aviation workers across the industry shared their experiences. Passengers joined in, posting their own observations of unequal treatment they'd witnessed. The airline's initial response made things worse. Their carefully worded statement suggested the pilot had misunderstood what happened that day, calling it an unfortunate miscommunication. They highlighted their diversity initiatives, programs that employees quickly pointed out existed only on paper, with no real support or follow-through. 10 days after the story broke, several major corporations announced they would no longer use Skyway Airlines for business travel until the discrimination issues were addressed. Travel agencies began steering customers to competitors. The stock dropped another 12%. The pilot hadn't wanted to bring down a company. He just wanted to be treated fairly. The weight of what was happening kept him up at night. Was this going too far? Would thousands lose their jobs because of his stand? His doubts faded when he received a handwritten letter from a young black boy, maybe 10 years old. It read, "I want to be a pilot too. Thank you for making it easier for me when I grow up." 2 weeks into the crisis, the airline board called an emergency meeting. The CEO, who had dismissed the allegations as overblown, was asked to resign. 3 vice presidents followed. The board chair made a public statement acknowledging the company's failures and promising comprehensive reform. The pilot was invited to meet with the board. He brought his lawyer and 2 other pilots who had similar experiences. The meeting lasted 6 hours. "We failed," the board chair admitted. "Not just you, but everyone who experienced what you did. We need to fix this, and we need your help to do it right." The investigation expanded beyond Skyway. Other airlines began internal reviews, afraid of being the next target of scrutiny. The FAA announced an industry-wide examination of hiring and promotion practices. Pilots' unions issued statements supporting the investigation and promising to advocate for equal treatment. For the first time in his career, the pilot felt heard. His phone rang with a call from his mother. "I saw you on TV," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would have been so proud. He always said you were meant to fly, but maybe this is why you were really meant to fly, to change things for others." He looked out his window at the night sky, thinking about all the other pilots who would now have a fairer chance. The journey wasn't over. Real change would take years, not weeks, but something important had started. Tomorrow, he would fly again. The airline had scheduled him on a prime international route, his first. As he reviewed his flight plan, he smiled at the thought of all the young people who might see him in the cockpit and think, "I can do that too." Sometimes, being told to wait outside is exactly what you need to find the courage to walk through the door. The pilot's story was no longer just a news item, it had become a movement. People across the country were talking about it. Morning shows wanted interviews. Late-night hosts made jokes about the airline executives. Social media couldn't get enough of it. "Never thought I'd become famous for being told to wait outside," the pilot told his mother on the phone. She didn't laugh. "You're not famous for waiting outside," she corrected him. "You're famous for refusing to wait anymore." The airline's public response shifted from denial to damage control. Their first statement had backfired badly when they suggested the incident was a misunderstanding. Now they hired a crisis management team who advised a more humble approach. The CEO appeared on national television looking somber in a dark suit. "We have heard the concerns," he said, carefully reading from a teleprompter. "Skyway Airlines is committed to creating an inclusive workplace for all our employees." The words sounded hollow, especially when viewers noticed he never actually apologized or admitted any wrongdoing. Behind the scenes, the airline's leadership was panicking. Their stock had dropped nearly 20%. Business contracts were being cancelled. Passengers were choosing other airlines. One board member leaked to the press that the company was losing millions each day the crisis continued. Several celebrities with large followings posted that they would boycott the airline. A famous basketball player tweeted, "Been flying with them for years. Always noticed how few black pilots they had. Now we know why." The post got shared hundreds of thousands of times. Corporate partners started distancing themselves. A major credit card company paused their co-branded airline rewards card. Hotel chains removed Skyway from their preferred partner lists. The damage was spreading beyond just ticket sales. The pilot watched all this unfold with mixed feelings. He hadn't wanted to destroy a company that employed thousands of people. He had just wanted to be treated fairly. Now people were losing bonuses, and there were rumors of potential layoffs if business didn't improve. "Is this what I wanted?" he asked his lawyer during a quiet moment between interviews. She put a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't create this situation. You just exposed it. They built this house of cards by treating people unfairly for decades. Don't blame yourself when it falls." The airline tried another approach. They reached out to several black employees, offering promotions and bonuses if they would speak publicly about positive experiences at the company. Most refused. One flight attendant who had been with the airline for 22 years told reporters, "They never offered me anything until they needed a black face to save them." That tells you everything. Then came an unexpected twist. A group of white pilots held a press conference supporting their black colleague. The most senior captain, a man with gray hair and 40 years of flying experience, spoke plainly into the cameras. "I've watched this happen for my entire career," he admitted. "I never spoke up. I told myself it wasn't my business. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. What happened to my colleague happens every day in big and small ways. We all saw it. We just pretended not to." His honesty cracked something open. More employees came forward, not just about race but about gender discrimination, ageism, and harassment. The airline had cultivated a toxic culture that affected everyone, though some more severely than others. The pilot received hundreds of emails from industry professionals. Some shared their own stories. Others simply thanked him for his courage. A group of young flight school students sent a photo of themselves standing together with a sign that read, "The sky belongs to everyone." 3 weeks after the story broke, Skyway's board of directors called an emergency weekend meeting that lasted into the early morning hours. On Monday, they announced major changes. The CEO and 3 top executives would step down immediately. An outside firm would conduct a full audit of company practices. A task force of employees from diverse backgrounds would help reshape company policies. Most surprisingly, they announced the creation of a new position, Chief Inclusion Officer with actual decision-making power and a seat on the executive team. When his phone rang the next day with a call from the board chair, the pilot was expecting another round of carefully worded statements or maybe a settlement offer to make him go away. Instead, he heard something unexpected. "We'd like you to consider taking on the new executive role," the board chair said. "You understand this company. You know what needs to change. And people trust you." The pilot sat in silence for a moment. Was this a real opportunity for change or just another PR move? "I'm not interested in being a figurehead," he finally responded. "If I do this, I need real authority to make changes." That's exactly why we're asking you, the chair replied. We don't need someone to make us look good. We need someone to make us be better. That night, the pilot couldn't sleep. He stood at his window again, watching planes cross the night sky, thinking about the weight of the decision before him. Taking the job would mean stepping away from the cockpit he loved. It would mean working alongside people who had ignored discrimination for years. It would be the hardest flying he'd ever done. But maybe this was why he'd become a pilot in the first place, not just to soar above the clouds himself, but to help clear the path for others to follow. The pilot's first day as Chief Inclusion Officer felt strange. For 15 years, he put on his uniform each morning, straightened his captain's stripes, and headed to the cockpit. Today, he wore a business suit and walked into the executive floor of Skyway's headquarters. Eyes followed him as he moved through the hallway. Some people smiled warmly. Others looked away quickly. A few whispered behind their hands. The executive assistant who greeted him seemed nervous, stumbling over her words as she showed him to his new office. They've never had someone like me up here, he realized. The thought wasn't just about his race, but about his background. He hadn't come from business school or climbed the corporate ladder. He'd spent his career in the sky, not in boardrooms. His office had a window overlooking the airport. He could see planes taking off and landing, the work he loved and now had stepped away from. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had he made the right choice? His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Proud of you. Those 3 words steadied him. He wasn't here just for himself. The board chair knocked on his door an hour later. Ready for your first executive meeting? Walking into the boardroom felt like entering another world. 12 people sat around a massive table, most of them white men in expensive suits. Their conversation stopped when he entered. The air felt thick with tension. Let me introduce our new Chief Inclusion Officer, the chair began. We've all seen him on TV, one executive interrupted with a tight smile. Quite the entrance into management. The pilot took a deep breath. This was going to be harder than he thought. But he hadn't survived 15 years of discrimination by backing down from challenges. I'm not here to be on TV, he said calmly. I'm here because this company has a problem that's costing us millions of dollars and hurting thousands of employees. My job is to fix that problem. I hope you'll all help me do that. His straightforward approach seemed to catch them off guard. The meeting proceeded with awkward politeness, but he noticed how they talked around issues, using corporate language to avoid saying anything specific. After the meeting, a vice president for operations, one of the few women in senior leadership, caught up with him in the hallway. They're scared of you, she said quietly. You've got more power than you realize right now. Use it before it fades. She was right. He had a window of opportunity while the company was still in crisis mode. Once the media attention died down, resistance to change would grow stronger. That afternoon, he requested data on hiring, promotions, pay scales, and route assignments for every employee. He announced the formation of employee advisory groups representing different backgrounds and roles. He scheduled listening sessions at crew bases across the country. Most importantly, he hired an independent firm to audit all company policies and practices. The changes didn't come easily. Some managers dragged their feet, claiming they were too busy to prioritize inclusion work. Others complained about lowering standards when he pushed for more diverse hiring pools. A few openly questioned whether discrimination was really that serious of an issue. During his 3rd week, an anonymous email circulated among some employees calling him a diversity hire who couldn't handle the real job of flying. The message stung, but didn't surprise him. What did surprise him was how many people came to his defense without being asked. The pilots' union issued a statement highlighting his exemplary flying record. Flight attendants shared stories of his professionalism in the air. Even ground crews spoke up about how he always treated everyone with respect, regardless of their position. Slowly, real changes began to take shape. The audit revealed pay gaps that couldn't be explained by experience or performance. These were immediately addressed with salary adjustments. Promotion criteria were rewritten to remove subjective language that allowed bias to creep in. Training programs were revised to include scenarios dealing with discrimination and harassment. Most significantly, hiring practices were completely overhauled. The airline created partnerships with flight schools in neighborhoods often overlooked by recruiters. They established mentorship programs pairing experienced pilots with newcomers from all backgrounds. They reviewed and standardized interview questions to ensure everyone was evaluated fairly. The pilot kept his promise to visit crew bases around the country. In airport lounges, hangars, and break rooms, he listened to employees share their experiences, both good and bad. Sometimes these conversations were uncomfortable, but they were always valuable. In Miami, a veteran flight attendant pulled him aside. "I've been here 30 years, she said. "This is the first time anyone from headquarters has actually asked about my experience and seemed to care about the answer." In Chicago, a young white pilot approached him awkwardly. "I didn't get it before," he admitted. "I thought people were being too sensitive. But I've been listening to my colleagues these past months, really listening. I was wrong. Thank you for making us have these conversations." 6 months into his new role, the airline industry magazine ran a cover story titled "Skyway's Transformation." The article detailed the company's comprehensive changes and noted that employee satisfaction scores had risen significantly. Applications from minority candidates had doubled. Customer perception of the brand was slowly improving. That evening, the pilot stood in his office, watching planes take off as the sun set. He missed flying every day. The freedom of the sky couldn't be replaced by an executive title or a corner office. His assistant knocked on the door. "The board chair wants to see you." "We've been reviewing the numbers," the chair said when they met. "Our stock price is recovering. Bookings are up. Employee retention has improved." He slid a folder across the desk. "But there's something else we want to discuss with you." The pilot opened the folder to find a proposal. He would continue as Chief Inclusion Officer, but also return to flying 1 week per month. The most senior pilot in the company was retiring, and they wanted him to take over the flagship international route, the one he'd been passed over for many times before. "We need you in both roles," the chair explained. "In the boardroom and in the cockpit. You can't change the culture from behind a desk alone. We need people to see what's possible." For the first time in months, he felt the familiar excitement he'd always had before a flight. He would fly again, not just for himself, but as a visible symbol of the changes taking place. The next morning, he hung his uniform next to his business suits. There was still much work to be done, challenges to face, and minds to change. But for the first time, he truly believed it was possible. Sometimes, being told to wait outside is the beginning of opening doors for everyone. 5 years later, the pilot stood at the front of a large conference room in a Dallas hotel. More than 300 airline executives, pilots, flight attendants, and industry leaders filled the seats. The room buzzed with conversation until he stepped up to the microphone. "When I was told to wait outside that crew lounge 5 years ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here today," he began. The audience fell silent. Many knew his story. Some had been inspired by it to make changes at their own airlines. Others had come because they were curious about the company that had transformed itself from an industry embarrassment to a model workplace. "Skyway Airlines isn't perfect," he continued. "We still have work to do, but I want to share what we've learned along the way." The statistics spoke for themselves. Skyway's workforce now reflected the diversity of the communities they served. Employee satisfaction scores had reached record highs. Their stock had not only recovered but outperformed competitors. Most importantly, complaints about discrimination had dropped by 87%. The pilot no longer worked full-time as Chief Inclusion Officer. After 3 years, he had trained his replacement, a talented young woman who had once been a flight attendant and had experienced her own battles with discrimination. He still advised the executive team but had returned to his first love, flying. Now he wore his captain's stripes on Skyway's premier international route. Passengers often recognized him, asking for photos or sharing stories about how his stand had affected them. Young black children would peek into the cockpit, eyes wide with possibility. "The changes we made weren't complicated," he explained to the conference audience. "We started by actually listening to our employees. We looked at our data honestly. We made our expectations clear. And we held people accountable." After his presentation, a pilot from another airline approached him. "I've been flying for 22 years, the man said quietly. "I've experienced everything you described, but I never had the courage to speak up. Thank you for doing what I couldn't." These moments still caught him off guard, the weight of what his actions had meant to others. He'd never set out to be a symbol or start a movement. He just wanted to be treated fairly. Later that evening, he joined a dinner with several airline CEOs. The conversation flowed easily now, unlike those first tense meetings in the boardroom years ago. These industry leaders now sought his advice, respected his perspective. Some had implemented similar changes at their companies, not just because it was right, but because Skyway had proven it was also good business. "Your airline took a hit at first," one CEO noted. "But look at where you are now. Your customer loyalty scores are the highest in the industry." The pilot nodded. People want to support companies that do the right thing, and employees work harder when they feel valued. On his flight home the next day, he performed his pre-flight checks as always, methodical, focused, professional. The co-pilot beside him was a young black woman who had come through Skyway's new training program. "I almost quit flight school," she told him during the quieter moments of their journey. "Then I saw you on the news. It made me think maybe there was a place for me in this industry after all." As the plane reached cruising altitude, he thought about how far they'd come. The airline had changed, but so had the industry. Other companies had followed Skyway's lead, not just with words but with action. Flight schools reported increased diversity in their student bodies. Industry conferences now regularly included sessions on inclusion and equity. But the change that meant the most to him happened in smaller moments. The way crew members from different backgrounds now worked together without the tension that had once been common. The mentorship programs that helped young people from all walks of life see aviation as a possible career. The casual conversations in crew lounges that no longer went silent when someone different walked in. Back on the ground, he walked through the terminal in his uniform. A woman stopped him, touching his arm lightly. "You don't know me," she said, "but my son is in flight school now because of you. He never thought it was possible before." This happened often enough that he had a standard response, a warm thank you and an offer to meet the aspiring pilot someday. But it never felt routine. Each story reminded him why that day 5 years ago had mattered. At home, he hung his uniform carefully in the closet. His flight logs now filled multiple books, a record of thousands of safe journeys, millions of miles in the air. But his most important journey had begun with being told to wait outside. On his desk sat a framed photo from Skyway's most recent graduation ceremony for new pilots. 28 faces smiled at the camera, men and women of all backgrounds, all wearing the same wings he had worked so hard to earn. The airline that had once told him to wait outside had become a place where everyone was welcome inside. And the industry that had once accepted discrimination as normal was now holding itself to a higher standard. Sometimes the most important flights aren't measured in miles but in progress, and sometimes being told to wait outside is exactly what you need to find the courage to change what's inside.